what didn't happen, and what's possible going forward. And ask those questions kind of with the lens of COVID in mind. So what seemed less possible before COVID, and what seems actually more possible during and after COVID. So we wanted to try to like apply that lens to this conversation, so that we get focused on like what we can do both in a special session, hi Maura Brown's cat, and in the next legislative session. It's a small enough group that I hope we will actually get a chance to do some like conversation and hear what you all think about it as well. Am I missing anything, Ashley, in setting this up?
No, sounds great.
Great.
One quick thing, if you have any questions, just put them in the chat and we'll respond to them as we go along.
Great. So I'm going to start by just giving us, starting by level setting a basic knowledge base here, to sort of share what I know happened in legislative session. If you don't already know this about me, my knowledge base tends to be a little bit a mile wide and maybe an inch deep. So it's kind of a what happened across the spectrum of session, not necessarily deep on any given part. So some of you, I hope, can flesh out the deep parts as well. Oh, and then process-wise, I'll do this PowerPoint to kind of level set, and then Ashley's going to kind of guide us through a conversation with Representative Gomez and take your questions and comments. So let me go ahead and try to share screen my presentation. Oops. I think I have to share screen before I do that. So obviously this has been a legislative session unlike any other one. It's just to re-ground us real quick. It's shaped in a lot of ways by these actors, the governor and the lieutenant governor. In the House, this is an old photo. Obviously Melissa Hortman is now the speaker and Kurt Dowd is the minority leader of the GOP in the House. And then Susan Kent, the new minority leader in the Senate, and Paul Gazelka, the majority leader in the Senate. It really is, in a lot of ways, these six folks who can drive the conversation and set the parameters for what's possible in any given session. Before I go to that, I wanted to say a little bit about, as I was putting this presentation together, my sense of frustration with the session actually abated a little bit. In that once I went through and looked at what actually happened in the last 3 months, there's actually a lot to be proud of and a lot that's quite impressive. So just the very fact of having a legislative body do as much as they did during a once in every 100 years global pandemic is itself an accomplishment. And even if you go beyond that, there are a number of like good things that happened. As much as I think we can and should be frustrated about the ones that didn't, I wanted to start by sharing with you what I think are some of the highlights of what did. So by my count, there were at least a dozen different bills that responded to the COVID pandemic, in sometimes fully, sometimes partially, but that's not an accomplishment to take for granted. It's easy to imagine a state not responding quite so comprehensively, and frankly, like in a bipartisan way, like this, there were people across the political spectrum who agreed to these things and voted for them. So the first batch there of like 1 through 4 were kind of early in session and set up a lot of the basic infrastructure to get federal money and to pay for what we needed to do. Obviously, there were then a whole set of kind of worker-related ones, workers' compensation related, a set of kind of administering the state and shifting deadlines within our programs. There were a few different things that kind of gave businesses more flexibility to try to operate during the pandemic. That's what a lot of the liquor license stuff is about, giving people and different institutions the ability to sell liquor when they otherwise wouldn't be able to, or in the context of a pandemic. And then there are a couple at the end here, the Farmer Lender Mediation Act and the Agricultural Supplemental Appropriations Bill that had kind of extended deadlines that farmers needed to meet to run their businesses, and did some direct COVID response appropriations for funders that were both all things that, like, for example, Land Stewardship Project was working on. So this was no small accomplishment, and is much of what the session was about, obviously. In addition to these, there were a number of, I thought, like, meaningful policy bills that happened. There was a version of the Alex Smith Insulin Affordability Act that passed early in session. There was a policy bill that banned marriage with minors. I think we were one of the last, maybe 2 states to do that, but we did it. There'd been a long-standing standoff around money for election protection. The Help America Vote Act, second round of funding, and funding that came in the Federal CARES Act for adapting our elections for a pandemic. There was the TCE ban, the Tobacco 21 legislation. It's a smaller bill, but for climate folks, there was a bill that expanded the promotion of using LED light bulbs in efficiency programs. And then right at the end of session, there was a bill passed that authorized spending a portion of the Renewable Development Account money. It was about $20 million on solar investments, setting up a new program for transition communities. What that means is communities that are losing fossil fuel infrastructure and need to plan for how the community is going to continue on after it. And then an innovative program with the Prairie Island Indian community to get to net zero emissions where they live. So all of those things also happened this year. There is, of course, a lot of unfinished business. And what I think are the key things that are going to be on the table heading into a likely June special session, there are at least 6 or 7. One is the bonding bill didn't happen. A separate bill, which is bonding for housing, also didn't happen. And at the end of session, got freighted with a set of policy proposals that the Democrats had not agreed to. The second is in the climate bucket, there are an environmental bucket. There's at least 3 things that I can think of. There's an energy efficiency bill called ECO, which had broad agreement, passed the floor of the House, but has not passed the floor of the Senate, but feels winnable. The legislature did not spend all of the renewable development account, so there could be another opportunity to spend the rest of that. And then the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund funding, which is the money that comes from the lottery and is guided by the work of the LCCMR, also did not get spent. There were meaningful differences between the House and the Senate, but that's still a possibility. The very last thing that the House was voting on at the end of session was the education policy bill. The Senate passed it minutes earlier, but because we ran past midnight, this did not get done, but feels like it's basically all but done, or at least I hope it is. The fourth thing is a little murkier, but we may have to have a real debate around the looming deficit that our state will face. So there's a cluster of things around budget, tax conformity proposals that the Senate passed, and the possibility of spending shifts where we take things we would pay in one fiscal year and push them into the next fiscal year to try to technically balance the budget, but not really cut the spending. And then the fifth thing is, I think there will continue to be a debate around COVID emergency powers. You saw that in the debate around bonding, and in legislation that came out of the Senate trying to limit or box in the governor's emergency powers or negotiate around them. Related to this, if there is more federal money or rules around how we spend our federal money, they could all become subjects of negotiations, as well as how some of the states' existing federal money gets spent in cities and counties other than Hennepin and Ramsey County. the state employee contracts, unless the Minnesota Management and Budget Office has offered a ruling, is in kind of a state of limbo. The House passed the contracts as is. The Senate amended them. I think there is a real legal question as to whether or not the Senate has the authority to amend those contracts, or if they have kind of de facto passed them by passing them. And then also there was an effort this year to get additional funding for home care workers who are working under extraordinary and hazardous circumstances during the pandemic. So that, I think, will come back in special session. This will all be shaped by a set of other factors, additional executive orders by the governor, any other federal action. For example, the House, the US Congress has passed a thing called the HEROES Act, which the Senate is saying is basically dead on arrival. But if there were another piece of federal legislation, that would shape it. And then obviously the biggest one is the course of the pandemic. None of us can predict exactly how that's going to go. And if it gets worse or better, that'll shape a lot. The other moments to keep an eye on as you're thinking about our session, the Minnesota Management and Budget Office publishes a couple of different regular updates. There's a monthly revenue report where we learn how much money is coming in. It's not going to be super illuminating until about August because of so many delayed payments on taxes in the state. And then there's a quarterly economic update, which is based on national modeling that the state uses. And the next batch of that will come out not in June, but in the July quarterly economic update. So there will be new news about our budget in July, and then again, the bigger one will be in August. And that's when we'll kind of have a better sense of what the budget situation is like for 2021. I feel like I've been talking forever. Let me pause. I can't monitor the chats while I've got my share screen on. Is there any other questions or
yes,
comments?
someone asked you to explain what the TCE ban is real quick.
Oh my gosh, this is where you're discovering it's a mile wide and an inch deep. I don't totally know. Representative Gomez, you voted on this. Do you remember what it is? Can you say more about it?
Yeah, sure. I also have I thought that my 3 roommates who are under 7 were not in the house, and they are. So I'm like right next to the freeway and on a windy day. So hopefully people can hear me. Yeah, so I think somebody added kind of on the TCE. It's like trichloroethylene, I think is what it is. So it was emitted by a facility that is in South St. Paul, maybe. It's not in South St. Paul. I don't know where. It's called water gremlin. It's a carcinogen. It has, and it's something that I believe is not regulated at the federal level, and so we did not a perfect kind of state level regulation, but we added a little bit more kind of controls around it. It's been, many of the workers at Water Gremlin have experienced negative health impacts, and their families have too. So it's sort of a thing that kind of sticks to your body and your clothing, and it's been and like a lot of these issues, it's been a difficult kind of balance, I think, of like, there are these jobs that are really damaging to human health and to the environment, and they pay really well, and they're family sustaining wage jobs. And so I know that we had like some kind of like the workers there were like, we need our jobs, we need our $25 an hour jobs or whatever, so it was something that Representative Wasilewic's been working on for many months with all parties involved, and kind of came to a conclusion that I think strikes a good balance between protecting human health and the environment and the sort of economic realities that working people are living with. So yeah.
Thank you. And then Betty provided a link to the MCEA website for a fact sheet for more information on the TCE ban as well.
Thank you, BT.
Not all of us are as informed as her. Chris, do you have more to say? And then Betty asked if there was bill numbers for the unfinished business that you talked about, but are all of those things like actually things that were presented as bills, or are some of them kind of just like concepts that we were interested in or other people were interested in but never actually made it into the hopper?
Let me answer that by just jumping back to the slide. So I'm going to jump back to share screen and then I'll share what I know. It's a little bit of a it's a little bit of a oh shoot it's a little bit of a mix. So numbers 1 through 3 are actual bills with bill numbers, and numbers 4 and 5 are more like topic areas where you could see different things coming together. I mean, there is a specific tax conformity bill in the Senate and the House, but it's really more like it's more of a topic.
And I'd add that on the sort of federal, one of the big things that was left undone was allocating the local government assistance from the CARES Act, which is $657 million. It's actually more money than we've spent on all other, like all those great things that were COVID related that Chris went over. That all doesn't add up to as much money as this was. And it felt really, I will say that I inserted myself into the process like pretty in an annoying way, I think, probably to people who were trying to negotiate on it, because it was really strange to me that there was just very little kind of conversation, I think, in the caucus about it. It didn't really have a hearing in committees. There was a bill that was drafted the last week. I mean, COVID time, like what, I guess it was the beginning of last week or mid last week, and was heard in Ways and Means on that, like a day later. And so it didn't go through kind of a regular vetting process. So that's one of the, I just saw that there's an article about it today in the Star Tribune, because the fact that the legislature didn't make a determination about how to allocate the money means that the governor can step in and do it himself, basically. And so there's sort of, it was interesting. I think that a lot of the things that were on the list that were COVID related happened when there was this like few weeks where we all were we were able to kind of work together to have, and where we developed a shared sense of urgency around kind of developing a response to public health and economic realities that people were living with. And then things took a turn, you know, and it was felt really related to the national conversation around sort of the way that the reopening has been, or like push to reopen has been politicized. So yeah, so I think so that $657 million to help to both help kind of cities and counties to make up for proactive investments that they're having to make, and things like, you know, PPE for first responders, and kind of figuring out how to help their staff telework and stuff like that. But also is designed to help cities and especially counties who deliver a lot of the public health services pay for their direct response to the COVID outbreak. It's a really big deal that that's just kind of sitting on the table. And so there's a desire to get that money, at least some portion of it, out to communities within the next few weeks, I think.
Do you know if the governor will try to spend it before you're back in special session, or do you think it'll still be on the table when you get back?
Well, so there were competing approaches from the Senate and House that were put forward. The House approach that was in a bill that was developed by Representative Marquardt sent 85% of the money, so about $557 million out to cities and counties on a per capita basis, and reserved 15% or 100 million for kind of a hot spot response fund. I personally, and many other people, after I convinced them that I was right, and the governor's office allocated or was advocating for a different split there. because, you know, places like Hennepin and Ramsey counties, because they're above 500,000, got a direct allocation from the CARES Act from the federal government. Any unit of government less than 500,000, the money goes through the state, and so then it puts a lot more power in our hands. But you know, Hennepin, Ramsey, Nobles, and Stearns counties are experiencing like really hotspots basically right now. Somebody did I'm trying to remember the exact numbers. I believe it was like somebody basically calculated per 10,000 people in those counties, like what the infection rate was. And in Hennepin, for example, it was like 35. And in Nobles County, which is where Worthington is, which is where the JBS pork producing plant is, was 500 cases compared to 32. So, you know, and that could be totally different in 3 weeks, right? We could have a different hotspot. So, so I think there is like a shared desire to get some of the money out the door. Like Marquardt's bill would have done the 85% per capita payment by June 15th, which is basically like when we're coming back into special session. And I don't know what the kind of timeline is that the governor had in mind, or what that split is between getting direct help out to cities and counties and towns right now versus like saving some money to respond, since, you know, it's really difficult for me to see like the infection and death rate going up every day and us like not putting aside more money for response in the future. I just think, like you said, the HEROES Act passed, but it's like we don't know if we're getting any more money from the feds. So so I'm hopeful that we'll get like a better split with the governor making the decision potentially. But I think that it's all kind of up in the air about how the process is going to work. I'm sorry, that's like probably really boring, but
Oh,
but it's a lot of money.
Yeah. It'll be a huge topic.
Yeah.
So
can one of you guys explain just in like 2 sentences basically the difference between state funding for things and federal funding, and like how the state has to balance our budget and like how that limits kind of what spending happens?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I'll say something, and then Chris probably is smarter about this stuff than I am, so we'll have something to add. But just kind of big picture, like basically like the federal government, the reason that we hear about like deficits and deficit spending all the time, and our national debt, is because the federal government, I think it's like the Treasury buys bonds. I don't even understand how this all works, but basically they're able to like borrow literally trillions of dollars and spend it on things. Usually they spend it on stuff like, you know, perpetual war or whatever. But in the last month, in, you know, the CARES Act round 1 was really an unprecedented investment in direct cash transfers to people who are experiencing you know, the economic impacts of COVID-19. And so, you know, this like, I think none of us thought that we'd be talking about like really talking about universal basic income, right, in 2020, but we were a couple months ago, and there is like a conversation about that. And or, you know, the $2,400, the $600 a week top up in unemployment insurance is a huge stimulus to our economy, because we have an economy that 70% of which is driven by consumer spending. And so I guess from what I've been reading, it's like economists from kind of across the ideological spectrum, like you saw Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, get up last week and say, we need to keep up with this economic stimulus for small businesses and individuals. We're going to need to borrow more money to keep our economy going during this time. And so that's like a way that the federal government is able to stimulate the economy. But state, Minnesota, like most states across the country, in our constitution, it says that we have to have a balanced budget, and so we are not allowed to borrow money to do things like direct cash payments to individuals, for example, or a lot of the other things that we would want to do. We have to figure out how to find savings in our current budget, or raise revenue through taxes in order to do additional spending. Chris?
I would add only a couple of short run things, which is that so we have to be balanced by the end of the biennium. So you can go above or below on the way there, but it's got to be projected to be balanced at the end. And because our last formal forecast actually had us with a deficit, the legislature is not under any legal obligation to balance a budget based on a interim projection or some other thing. I'm going to go into next what the projection was that was kind of an interim projection, but the legislature isn't required right now to do anything with the interim projection we have. The interim projection, however, does cross the legal threshold that the governor needed to cross to have substantial evidence to be able to go into our budget reserves. So it basically it's enough information to trigger the budget reserves. It's not an official forecast though, so it doesn't actually trigger the requirement to balance the budget before the end of the current biennium, if that makes sense. So Ashley, do you mind if I go to the rest of this little PowerPoint? So
wait, I'm sorry, can I add a couple of things on unfinished business quickly?
Yeah, please.
It's just one thing that we did was we passed this, the House passed, I think we called it like a COVID economic security package basically, but there was a bunch of resources in there for, I don't know if you talked about, well, for housing assistance, $100 million in housing assistance, school hourly worker pay, broadband. That was also where we had I think the state contracts were in there, a $500 one-time payment out of to families who are on the Minnesota Family Investment Program. So that's money that would come out of a fund that wouldn't impact our budget. But again, that was sort of a kind of economic stimulus idea of getting a one-time $500 payment to those families. And then very important emergency loans for small businesses because the PPP was such a disaster and SBA loans are very difficult for a lot of small businesses to access. So that included, a set aside for businesses owned by people of color and indigenous people who have been particularly left out of PPP, and a little chunk of money to support ethnic malls like Mercado Central and the Global Market and some other things that are in my district. So just wanted to throw that out there. Sorry.
Just a few things.
Just a few things.
So I tried to start my presentation by highlighting what I think is the sort of remarkable work that the legislature did in responding to the crisis. I'm now going to take the conversation in another direction, which is the incredible challenge we have in front of us. So let me share again my screen. So we did an interim budget projection a few weeks ago to give the legislature and the governor and the public some sense of how bad the economic recession has been on our state budget. In our February forecast, we had a $1.5 billion surplus. In our May 5th projection, not forecast, projection, we had a $2.4 billion deficit, which is a drop off of almost $4 billion in a matter of months. However, we have a state budget reserve of $2.3 billion, plus we have the CARES money to backfill some of the spending we have done or will do on COVID relief. So all of this nets out to be, not an insurmountable budget deficit, and potentially even if you spend the COVID money, puts us barely in the black, right? This, however, is all based on economic modeling that we got. So the state uses a national modeling firm called IHS Markit that we use to update our budget forecast quarterly. So if you kind of dig into what was IHS Markit saying a couple of months ago, it's a pretty different picture than where we are now. So our last budget forecast, the projection and the forecast were based on this idea that we would have a precipitous drop in economic activity across the US. So what you'll see on this line graph is that basically in the second quarter, meaning the second, like, what would it be? April, May, June, you were going to see roughly about a 10%, 8 to 10% drop in economic activity across the US, but then it was going to start to rebound by the fourth quarter and rebound pretty vigorously in 2021, right? That was kind of the theory. That thinking has shifted pretty significantly in economic thinking at a national level. So the Federal Reserve Bank in Atlanta has a model they run that's called GDP Now, which is not meant to forecast the future of our GDP, but like where we are currently. And GDP is the gross domestic product, so it's kind of a measure of the sum of all economic activity across the U.S. in goods and services, manufacturing. So they have a model which basically just crunches numbers to try to give you a sense of where GDP is in the current quarter. And the one that they published as of this week was that the gross domestic product was going to fall 42% in the second quarter, right? So we were predicting 8 to 10% in our last model. They are now predicting 42%. So it's one of the more pessimistic models, but it's a fairly credible model. And you'll see the other ones are all trending down as well. So it's looking like it will be deeper than we expected. And then this is sort of backed up by other estimates of unemployment. So the same firm we use estimated unemployment to peak at about 10% in I want to say the third quarter. I can't see it now, but it's a fairly in the fourth quarter. So it was sort of predicting a slower wave of closures and unemployment. And their pessimistic scenario was a faster crash of a 22% unemployment rate. When the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the last couple of weeks published the actual unemployment rates for April, the actual number in the US was 14.7%, already ahead of what we were predicting. And a thing called the U6 underemployment rate was 22.8%. So the U6 underemployment rate is a somewhat better model in that it isn't just people who've declared that they're unemployed. It also includes people who are, not getting the hours that they want, so they're underemployed, or they're still employed but they're not working at all. And it includes people who have just stopped applying. So people who have kind of removed themselves from the workforce, so they don't report themselves as unemployed because they just don't think of themselves as employable or being employed. So it is a more accurate measure of how deep the unemployment crisis is. Last week, Goldman Sachs estimated that we would reach a peak of 25% unemployment and a U6 rate of 35% unemployment at the deepest part of this year. And I never imagined I would be on a call where we mentioned Jerome Powell twice, but last week, Jerome Powell was interviewed on TV and asked if unemployment would reach 20 to 25%. And he said, those numbers sound about right for what the peak may be. So the net of all of this is that our own estimate that our last forecast was based on is, roughly half as bad as what people are saying the situation will be now. So that's not a prediction about what our next forecast will be, other than to say it will be worse and significantly worse, more likely than not. There. All right.
A question, yes. So a question came up in the chat if that was an annualized drop. I don't know exactly which part he was referring to.
No, so it's not an annualized drop. So if you take the deepest part of the GDP crash and average it out with where we get by the end of the year, it tempers it significantly. So those are numbers that are like the deepest part of the trough, not the annual total, if that makes sense.
And then there was a question earlier before you started, which was more specific about Minnesota. And Mike Rowland asked, what are some Minnesota revenue and tax increases that could help fund recovery? And I knew that Representative Gomez would be eager to talk about that question. So I wanted to make sure we bounced back to her for that.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question. So, during like, it's interesting just like, you know, getting into the state legislature, like, and hearing about the legacy of the Pawlenty administration, just from a budgetary standpoint, about how many things like local government aid, the, you know, per pupil allocation for E12 education spending, and probably like many other things we've just kind of recovered to the non-inflation adjusted levels that of investment that we used to make in public goods in Minnesota in 2002. And so this is part of like a larger trend in this country, and the states have all followed suit since the 1984 Reagan tax cut, which just has been, you know, this kind of that the right wing with an anti-tax message have really owned the entire frame on the way that we talk about revenue and the way that we talk about taxes. And the reason is because, and they do this to me all the time, like, is they're like, talk about the burden of taxes on the middle class and on working class people, which is a real concern. But what you see is over time, over like 4 decades, is that more and more we're relying on really regressive taxes to fund basic public services. So that's why your property taxes go up. You know, local municipalities will get approval to use sales taxes. Why we're talking about a gas tax, frankly. I mean, I know that's like a probably unpopular opinion, like, but the gas tax is like super regressive. You know, rich people who have Teslas and like cars that plug into the wall and get charged for free, like, don't pay that. But people in my community who drive cars from the 90s, before anybody cared about gas mileage, right, are disproportionately paying that. People who live in greater Minnesota who have to drive 40 miles to go to the grocery store are disproportionately paying for that. And so we've had to move away from progressive taxation tools, which ask the rich and corporations to pay their fair share. And so it's why, you know, you see all of these sort of, if you look at the, you know, the various tax rates that people are paying, that there's been a huge shift from, you know, people who are really benefiting from our economy kicking in more money to make sure that everyone's taken care of, and more it's relying on lower income people to pay for basic services, again, through, you know, property taxes that get passed on through rent or sales taxes or whatever. So there are, Chris and I have been part of a conversation about kind of coming up with some revenue ideas. You looked at my bill introductions last year, it's almost like I was anticipating us needing to raise billions of dollars of revenue. But so one is that, you know, if we add a 5th tier to our income tax system, that would be a tax on the top 1% of income earned in Minnesota. So for a married couple, it's like $560,000. For an individual, it's half that. If we ask them to pay an extra 4 or 5 cents on every dollar they make above that level, it would impact less than 50,000 people in Minnesota, and it would raise $2 billion per biennium, which gives you an idea of the amount of money that is like, that's there, right? That we read about, you know, the growing economic inequality, and it's like, you can, when you do the runs on these things, it's like kind of mind-blowing. We could raise another, in the first year, it's like 850 million, and it's, you know, half that moving forward per year by closing loopholes that allow corporations to stash money in offshore tax havens. And interestingly, this was actually part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the Trump tax cut, which handed $1 trillion to corporations right before we're facing this economic impact, right, let's say. But sort of in exchange for a really significant cut in the corporate tax rate, a 40% cut in the corporate tax rate, they instituted what they called base broadeners. So that's like means that they're increasing the tax base by bringing more money out of these offshore tax havens and bringing them back into the U.S. so that they can be properly taxed. We heard a bill authored by Representative Steve Sandell in Taxes Committee last year that instituted an additional 3% tax on capital gains. So that's like if you make money on the stock market, for example. Again, impacts very few ratepayers. That raised $300 million a year. Of course, that was based on what we'd anticipated capital gains would be last year, and so I'm sure that would be a little bit different. But it's been interesting to see how the Fed has taken all these steps to prop up the stock market. The stock market's like doing okay now again, right? While we're looking at 20% unemployment. We could do a wealth tax. I've been in conversations with House Research. I have kind of like the skeleton of a bill on that one, but that idea needs to be sort of more fully cooked. And then there's a windfall tax that Chris Conry brought to the table that he can probably understand. But like the big picture, right, is that Minnesota is a very wealthy state. We have enough. We don't have to resort to, looking at a huge deficit is like scary, like when you are responsible for crafting a balanced budget. But we have other options, and we can ask those who have benefited from the widening wealth and income inequality in our country in this time, right? When we're asking grocery store workers to continue to go to work and make sure that our supply chain's moving, when we're asking people who work in food processing plants and people who pick crops, who are migrant farm workers, to step up and to continue going to work to keep everything moving, then we can ask the wealthiest individuals in our state to kick in a few more dollars in this time of need. And so I'm really excited about thinking about how we set up a conversation where we're not going into a really scary budget time with a deficit analysis and we don't have enough. And what we're going to need to do is do what we always do, which is cut programs that are like safety net programs that help out the most vulnerable among us in order to balance our budget. It's like we have another option. And so I'm excited for us all to like push back against the frame of like taxes bad, government bad, like free market enterprise good. These are the times that we see what it means that we've listened to, what's his name? Grover Norquist, isn't it? Who said like, shrink government down to the size where you can drown it in a bathtub. And it's like, that gets you like no ability to do a national procurement of PPE, no ability to have a national program of testing or contact tracing. Like disinvestment in government has consequences, and we're seeing it right now, So that was kind of a rant, but that's my thoughts about
it. I promise you I won't spend more than 60 to 90 seconds on these somewhat more boring solutions. But there's a handful of other things that I think, especially if we have a $4 to $5 billion deficit, that the state will start to look at. One is federal tax conformity. So if you imagine we start to calculate, basically we all calculate our federal taxes, which then gives us a number, which is our taxable income, which we then use to start computing our state income taxes. And the state can decide, we don't want to use the federal number that's based on some tax deduction we don't like. So we could basically say, we're no longer going to follow some parts of the federal tax code in order to change where we start our own calculation of our own taxes. So detaching from some of the Trump tax cuts would be one way to have more taxable income in Minnesota. A second is, and we did this during the Pawlenty years, we could see, I think we probably will start to see a set of payment shifts. And what that means is we owe schools a certain amount per pupil on a regular basis. We could just say, we're still going to give them the same amount, but we're going to do it on July 1st instead of June 30th, just push it over the deadline so that it counts as balancing and doesn't.
Oh, I'm sorry, you guys.
No problem. And then you can do the same thing with certain like HHS expenses. And then the other thing that I think could happen would be kind of the rating of the couch cushions. So there are funds that are unallocated. So like a thing I said in my earlier presentation, like the renewable development account, if there is unspent money that's dedicated for certain purposes, the legislature essentially has the power to go in and raid those funds. And so they will probably go after every bit of unspent money they can that's not spent by next January.
So we have like a really big, broad question for the other half of this conversation, which was like, how has the massive like changes that we've seen happen in the past few months changed the way that we think about what's possible of what we can do? And so that's really Chris, or Aisha, whoever wants to answer this. I just wonder about what you're thinking about that. Like how we've managed to shift our schools and colleges and workplaces. We've changed all of our habits and routines. How does that kind of thing, how has it shifted how you think about what's possible, what we can do? Just a really big question for the last 7 minutes.
Totally. I mean, I guess like we talked a little bit about it earlier, you know, I think that for people, for me personally, I feel like there's, it's interesting to see conversations around ideas that were ridiculous 3 months ago, like actually having legs. You know, I think about even the fact that this isn't necessarily having, I mean, actually though, I think it is having to do with COVID. The Sky Without Limits cooperative, which has been tenants organizing in a slumlords for many years, just recently struck a deal to buy the buildings from the slumlord who'd been refusing, just totally intransigent, shitty person, just like trying to be terrible. But guess what, dude? The bottom's out of the market. Like, what are you gonna do? So that's like one of the most beautiful things that I've seen happen in a few months, and it is related to the way that this crisis is revealing just some of the ridiculousness of some of these systems that we've created. Like when you're looking at a 25 to 30% unemployment or underemployment rate, like, can you still argue that having everybody get their insurance through their employer is the right approach? Like, not credibly, you can't, right? So there's space in these conversations for us to like think about what it means to build a system that's like resilient and responsive to human needs and isn't just designed to like maximize profits for a few people who are really politically influential. And the fact that that profit relies on people, it relies on us, it relies on exploitation of labor, it relies on exploitation of the earth, it relies on you know, on underpaying.
Oh no, you're frozen. Okay. You want to jump in, Chris?
Unfreezing. Are you back, Representative? So I've been thinking a lot about the ways in which the very short-run crisis that we're in is weirdly parallel to the long-run crisis, semi-long-run crisis that is climate change. And so if you imagine like, you know, it's a like great invisible like thing that is global in nature and requires like massive collective response in which everybody is acting on behalf of people that they may never meet or see. I mean, it's like weirdly almost parallel, right? And I think it's kind of remarkable how well we've done, right, nationally, as a state, and as the world, in people restraining themselves on behalf of, you know, healthcare workers, elders, people they themselves may not firsthand know. And I think in some ways, to me, it's like made me relatively optimistic. Like, in spite of the crazy protests that are happening, most Republicans still want public health measures, right? Most people support it and are doing it. Most people, the overwhelming majority of people, are willing to forego some really basic stuff to try to like make everybody safer. So I think
Yeah,
there's,
Aisha back too. Just
I don't know how to translate all of that to climate action, but I think it's like the same public virtues that made the COVID response possible are the same public virtues that we can, muscularize in the climate debate.
Representative Gomez, are you back?
Yeah, sorry. I'm having like hilarious problems over here. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's exactly what Chris was just saying, right? Is that there is some reorientation that's happening. It feels like a reorientation to reality as it is for, and especially, thinking about the way that this like has just sort of revealed the underlying realities that people are living with. You can't have an economy where like 40% of people couldn't withstand a $400 unintended cost and expect like to maintain an economy that makes billions of dollars for people. Those things are incompatible in the current time. And I'm also hopeful about, again, it's like if we can move past this sort of like anti-government, anti-collective action, like individualism and lack of acknowledgement of our need for each other, like the way that we really do need one another, then maybe we can come together and work on climate change and work on economic inequality in a way that actually like is effective and puts people at the center.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us. I think we wanted to do like, Aurora, are you here? We wanted to just tell people real quick about what our plans are for the rest of the year and how 100% Campaign is mobilizing and taking action for the things we're working for. So Aurora, do you want to give a few minutes and then we can wrap up?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My network bandwidth says it's low and now I can't. 1 second. There we go. Okay. Hi, everybody. If you don't know me, I am Aurora Vatrin. I am the political director of the 100% Campaign. We are building a giant relational organizing program that addresses where the reality of our society is right now with the crisis and with COVID. And so we are making sure that our organizing meets people where they're at and meets people's needs. So we're going to be launching our voter program June 12th and 13th. So we'll have a 2-day launch where we get everybody on the same page about our mission, our goals, get everyone really excited and trained up. The program is running June to November, and it's as easy as starting to check in with the folks in your own network just to see how they're doing. So we have a goal of contacting tens of thousands of Minnesotans to make sure that they have the resources that they need to hold their elected officials accountable to the things that they care about, whether it's climate, revenue solutions, and resiliency. And so that we can help build candidates who are going to be champions on climate, because we know what happens in the election of 2020 is going to determine what we can actually get done in the legislature in 2021, how we can implement really good ideas and solutions we've heard here today. Like those things aren't possible unless we get to work June to November to make sure we are electing folks that have our best interests at heart. So if you are interested in getting involved, I will put the registration link to our big June voter launch, which is the 12th and the 13th, into the chat. I will also include my email if you're unsure that that's like the right way for you to get involved. I would love to talk with you more. And I will also put the link to our website to sign up to get more information. Oh, you're muted.
Hi. Okay, thank you, Aurora. Thanks, Chris, and thank you, Representative Gomez. Congratulations on wrapping up your first term as a legislator. Slater. There we go. And thank you, everybody, who joined us. We appreciate all of you, and we will put up this video for further watching later. So join us again. Bye.